A week ago, we witnessed the great Trump-Zelensky pash-up in the Oval Office. A furious war of words after which the Ukrainian president and his entourage were asked to leave the White House. Now, things have been moving quickly since then. The United States has paused all military aid to Ukraine. Earlier this week, President Zelensky issued a tacit apology for his conduct. He says he's prepared to sign the minerals agreement that he was supposed to sign last week in the White House. And this week, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said something we had suspected all along, that the Russia-Ukraine war, now in its fourth year, was actually a proxy war between NATO and Russia. And we got more evidence of that. The US has shut off its intelligence pipeline to Europe. American aerospace company Maxar Technologies has suspended Ukraine's access to its satellite imagery services. The British supplied Storm Shadow missiles are useless in Ukraine because Trump has blocked US intelligence from being shared with allies in Europe. The message is clear. Trump wants a peace deal, but on his own terms. Europe will not be allowed to call the shots in ending this conflict. The art of the deal is in full play now on a global scale. Tonight we're discussing 5 big questions. Has the US shut down the Ukrainian war machine? Can Europe fight Russia without the United States? What's the future of NATO under Donald Trump? Will Donald Trump wean Russia away from China? The reverse Nixon-Kissinger move that we've been discussing all of this month. And finally, is this the end of the post-World War II world? Now, joining me to decode the moves on this game of hyper-fast 3D geopolitical chess are Fred Ware, Abhijit Iyer Mitra, and Professor Scott Lucas. Gentlemen, welcome to the News9 Plus show. Abhijit, first explain to all of us here this scenario of what's unfolding in Europe right now. Ukraine seems to have gone dark. No US intelligence support, no targeting data. What's going on really right now?
Intel was really the biggest piece of the pie. I don't think we realize this in India, but America has this gigantic, awesome Intel setup where you can get near instantaneous information just pumped through different channels, given to you, and you come up with the targeting solutions to then fire. This affects not just deep within Russia. So
Right.
leave the storm shadows and things like that, even deep artillery. The MLRS, the HIMARS
Yes.
variant that's been given to Ukraine, and things like that. Even the drone strikes on Russian positions, the smaller drone strikes. In order for you to know where they are, you need systematic intelligence collection, its transmission for the troops on the ground to understand what to do and where, what to attack, etc., etc. That has now gone out of the window. The Ukrainians are essentially fighting blind. Now, Russia has an intel system. Europe has some systems, but they're quite blind without the Americans, really.
Yes.
Because NATO was meant to be a sort of synergistic collaboration of lots of little bits and pieces. The Europeans have some pieces, the Americans always have the entire piece. Now, with American intel going out, they will not be able to conduct any kind. When I say strategic strikes, I don't even mean within Russia. When you see troop concentrations happening, 40, 50 kilometers on the Russian side of the front line, Ukraine's possibly not going to get that intel unless it's flying its own F-16s with reconnaissance pods or Mirage 2000s with reconnaissance pods, whatever, constantly monitoring them. They are not going to get the access to all of this anymore. I would expect that, combined with the cutoff of military aid, to start affecting the battlefield almost instantly.
Right, affecting the battlefield almost instantly. Abhijit Iyer Mitra there on what Trump is doing to Ukraine and its war machine right now. But Professor Scott Lucas, this is an unprecedented situation that we're looking at here. America turning the lights off on all intelligence cooperation with its European allies. Has this ever happened before? Seems to be unprecedented.
No, we've certainly had rifts in the past. For example, there were rifts between the U.S. and its allies over U.S. operations in Vietnam. There were rifts over the U.S. assault on Iraq in 2003. But no, we've never had this threat by a U.S. government, which effectively is no longer allied with Europe. And there's two important points we need to make to
Yes.
cut through the propaganda to get to the reality. First, with respect, your title's a bit misleading. This is not a U.S. or Trump war for peace.
Right.
This is Trump siding with Russia. And the reason why I say that is all of us want peace. Ukraine
Yes.
has had proposals to end the Russian invasion since November 2022, but the Russians haven't accepted them. What the U.S. has now done is has effectively gone into the talks with Russia on Russia's terms. And what does Russia want? Let us be clear where this could head. Russia wants to annex more than a quarter of Ukraine. It wants to lift U.S. sanctions. It wants to prevent Ukraine having any type of security arrangement, including with the West, and it wants to remove the Zelensky government. And the second thing we need to do, with respect again, is we need to stop using propaganda term proxy war, which is the Kremlin's term, even
Right.
if the U.S. Secretary of State is using it. This is not a proxy war. This is a Russian invasion. It was not NATO that invaded Ukraine or invaded Russia. It was not NATO that attacked Estonia in 2007 or Georgia in 2008. And it certainly wasn't NATO that attacked Russia in 2022. And Russia uses that line of proxy war to divert us from the fact that this is a Russian attempt to conquer its neighbor. And although it has really not had great success in doing so far, it won its biggest victory when Donald Trump was put into the White House
Right.
in January.
Fred Wyatt, you're in Moscow. The points that Professor Scott Lucas has made, the fact that Trump seems to be towing the Russian line, especially with Marco Rubio's statements on the proxy war. Do you believe that's increasingly the case, that the Trump administration seems to be closely aligned with the Russian line on the war in Ukraine?
I think we're looking at a full narrative shift in Washington, that's for sure. You know, everything was assumed one way and done one way, and then the government changed and people came in who see things completely differently. This is obvious, and it's pretty sweeping. As for what Moscow will think or do, they're obviously really pleased with these developments, and it is what Putin has been telling the Russian people all along, that we're not fighting Ukraine, we're fighting the collective West. And now it seems to be pretty obvious that there's a lot of truth to that. If Ukrainian missiles can't fly when the United States turns off its intelligence services, then that's obvious that direct American participation in the war makes it necessary for Ukraine. Anyway, I think that Putin has convinced most Russians that that is the case already, and these latest developments will seal that argument pretty much with the Russian people. I think Trump is trying to get ahead of reality, because Russia has been winning the war gradually in a grinding, slow, incremental way. I think Trump wants to get ahead of that. He isn't turning pro-Russian. All of a sudden, he has a longer-term plan, which will involve what he has achieved in the last week. It's getting Ukraine on side with his deal. That's what he wanted first. Now he'll turn to Putin, and he'll probably find that Putin isn't going to accept a lot of the terms, especially an immediate ceasefire, which the Russians do not consider to be in their interests. Also, some idea that Ukraine down the road would be an armed neutral state like Finland was during the Cold War. I think the Russians will rule that out. They want substantial demilitarization of Ukraine going forward. I don't think they care who is its president, but they do want conditions, neutrality, demilitarization, and so on that will be fixed and permanent. I don't think that's Trump's idea of a peace settlement. So we'll probably see Trump putting the screws to Putin in the coming weeks. I think the Russians are expecting that. They don't think
Right.
it's going to be easy, and they do not think that Trump is their boy.
Right, absolutely. Abhijit Iyer Mitra, President Trump seems to have indicated something like that in the last couple of days when he said that there is something that he has in mind for Russia as well. They're not going to like that very much. What kind of screws could the United States put on Russia, which it has not already tried in the last couple of years?
Well, see, this is the problem. When you get rid of all the tools at your disposal, with sanctions and cutting off of everything, there's very little then you can do to add additional pressure. This is something we've seen repeatedly with North Korea as well. When you've applied all the pressure, what is left for you to do beyond that? So we've basically gotten to the stage where I don't think there's going to be much pressure on Putin. Is there going to be diplomatic pressure at the negotiations? I think what's going to happen is entirely carrots, and that's never a good strategy.
Right.
Because in any negotiation, you need both carrots and sticks. But you've exhausted the sticks. I'm, racking my brains to see what other sticks you can come up with. And there's very little outside of, offering NATO membership to Ukraine, to the rump Ukraine. Now, this is a proposal that Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, says that was an American proposal, which is Ukraine will be neutral, but if there's any violation of its sovereignty, it will confer an automaticity to Ukrainian membership of NATO. Let's see. I mean, this is one of the things, but sitting here, I'm very hard pressed to say what more the West can do to Russia at the moment.
What more can the West do to Russia at the moment, Professor Scott Lucas? What sticks, are left with the West now to deal with Putin?
We're leaving out something important here, which is, with respect, the rest of the world. It's interesting that Fred Ware, beside that deceptive line, Russia is winning. It's not. Actually is saying, yes, Russia is going to present an ultimatum because they think they have Trump on side. And Trump has actually bent to Russian will since 2017 over Ukraine, when Vladimir Putin pulled him aside at the G20 summit in Germany. But what we have seen within the last few days with this recognition of what the Trump administration is doing, let's talk about it. The European Union and its member states have just agreed to pursue an 800 billion euro plan for investment and development of defense for European states and Ukraine. European states and other countries, including Canada, including Australia, including Japan, are talking about ratcheting up non-military aid. They're talking about what they can do to provide a security guarantee if the United States stands aside. And that security guarantee may not just simply be troops to protect Ukrainian facilities in the west of the country. It may, as Georgia Maloney proposed yesterday, an Article 5 commitment to Ukraine by NATO without Ukraine actually joining NATO. What I've been struck by, because I've been talking to people in Brussels all this week, is they don't believe that this is over. They actually feel energized by this, that they need to step up now. And I think this is true of other states like Canada, which is if the United States is going to effectively accept the Russian invasion and the Kremlin's propaganda to justify this invasion, then they need to work with other countries. And that will include reach outs to countries like India, to make sure that Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial independence is not abandoned.
Right. Professor Lucas, we've seen that, of course, Europe coming together behind Ukraine, and also the fact that President Macron has spoken out about extending the French nuclear umbrella to Europe. But, Fred Weyer, how realistic is this? The European defense minus the United States, a NATO minus the United States, is this any kind of credible military alliance you think that can result in tangible outcomes in this war?
It may be over years. It certainly makes sense for Europe to develop its own military alliance, its own intelligence capabilities and so on. But the news that Storm Shadow missiles, which are British, gifts to Ukraine, can't work without American intelligence inputs, pretty much tells you that most of Europe's military capabilities are dependent on the United States. So I don't know how that's going to go. I really wish Europe well, but in the shorter term, Russia, and I've been talking to a lot of foreign policy experts here in Moscow, and the thing they say is we are winning, and all the news from the 1,000 kilometers of the front line suggests the Russians are inching forward all along the line, and the Ukrainians are falling back. This latest news isn't going to make it easier for the Ukrainians, but the Russians were winning before. And the thing that most Russian experts say to me is, if it doesn't work out in the talks with Trump, we'll keep fighting. The Russian economy is growing. I mean, I live in the consumer economy. I see no signs of rationing or anything like that. That tells you that if Russians have all their consumer goods, troops at the front definitely have everything too. So as far as I can see also, Russian society is consolidated behind Putin, and none of this latest news is going to make it less so. So I think the Russians will just keep fighting until they get a settlement that they want, Trump or no Trump.
Right. Russians will keep fighting until they get what they want, Trump or no Trump. Abhijit Iyer Mitra, this point that Fred Weyer made about the fact that the Russians are resolved to keep fighting till the bitter end. They've, of course, incurred heavy losses in doing that, but that's the Russian way of war fighting. It's always been since the Second World War. Tell us about how Europe could actually deal with a US exit, if you can call it that, out of this entire military thing. They've just demonstrated this by, shutting down the intelligence pipeline. Is a military alliance in Europe, say, headed by France and Germany, is it very realistic to imagine that that can take up all the heavy lifting that the United States once did?
So there are two things I want to respond to first. This notion that either Russia is winning or Ukraine's winning is a bit like, World War I generals saying we're winning after the Battle of Passchendaele or Verdun and things like that. But this kind of trench warfare, anybody claiming that they're winning or losing is, honestly, it really gets to me. I don't see anybody winning right now. I just see it as a nasty World War I style. It's exactly just that. The weapons might have changed, but the nastiness and trench warfare continue. Number one. Number two, there was this thing about outreach to India and things. I think, the rest of the world actually wants to just stay out of it. It's like what Jaishankar said, that Europe thinks that its problems are the rest of the world's problems, and they're not. Remember, Pakistan did to us on Kashmir exactly what Russia did to Ukraine. And Europe was quite happy to, sit around, make false equivalences, continue with trade ties and military ties with Pakistan as if nothing happened. So, for India to give two hoots realistically about, we may put on some crocodile tears here and there and send some aid and some tears and some song and dance here and there, but realistically, we just want to wash our hands off it. Let's come to Europe's defense. Europe's problem right now is it's been so dependent on the American shield.
Yeah.
It has diverted most of its money towards its social welfare and I won't even say economics, I would just say social welfare, because if you look at it, the biggest European economy, Germany, is about as poor as the poorest poorest American states, Alabama and Missouri and things like that. They have a population that's much higher than the US at about 440 million, but a GDP that's much lower than America, an average GDP of the EU. Can they do it? Yes. Do the economics exist? Yes. Where's the money going to come from unless you're going to go into severe debt? On top of all now, and a European, do you think they're going to be voting for their social welfare or increased defense? I see all kinds of political problems out here. I see logistical problems out here. Now, when Lockheed Martin or Boeing decide to build, say, the F-35, Lockheed Martin will go around scouting for the best subcomponents and parts at the best price that they can get. In Europe, because everything is sort of a coalition per system, national work share matters. You have to buy only what that nation produces.
Right.
There is no economies of scale as we
Right.
understand operational out there, which is why European defense is so highly problematic. The one country that has probably maintained almost a early 20th, late 19th century view of manufacturing industrialization and maintaining national industry is France. But Britain's gone down, the completely finance sort of path, and Germany is deindustrializing as we talk at the moment.
Right.
There's also the issue of, Europe has a very different approach to defense than America. They may be intercompatible, but they're not the same. You remember in Stalingrad, in the Battle of Stalingrad, uh, almost twice, possibly three times the number of Tiger tanks that were destroyed by their own crews because of mechanical failure. And there is this preponderance in Germany of over engineering things and things like that. There are lots of philosophical, industrial, work share, political issues. Right now, you remember Macron's speech during the peak of COVID. He said, we're not going to depend on China, we're going to industrialize,
Yes.
produce all our things. What happened to all of that? The moment the threat goes, they just divert their attention somewhere else.
Talking about COVID, Abhijit, I was just reminded about how Wang Yi was in Moscow yesterday meeting Putin and telling him that they still support Russia no matter what. The no limits partnership, I'm going to ask Professor Scott Lucas about that. This no limits partnership between China and Russia must frighten the West a lot, especially the United States. There's a strategy in place to wean Russia away from China, do a reverse Nixon-Kissinger, if that could be called that, in 2025. You think that's possible? That's the long game that Trump is playing here?
First of all, I want to thank my friend for that brilliant summary just now in terms of the position we find ourselves in. And just to add to that, before getting your question addition, I agree with what's said on Europe, but I think we're going to see a very different Europe now. I think
Right.
it does need to rethink its approach to countries like India. It needs to recognize the mistake it's had in the past. And it needs to say that territorial integrity for sovereignty is for all, not just for some. It also is changing in terms of its approach to defense expenditure to get that concentration. It will take time. But if you look what Germany has just announced with a historic shift, if you look at the EU, they now know they've got to step it up in terms of defense and industrial production and hope the U.S. comes back. And
Right.
Ukraine is now outstripping Russia in some areas. In terms of China and Russia, China's playing both sides. Recall that Wang Yi also went around the Munich Security Conference talking to Europe about how Ukraine has to be part of the talks and
Yes.
cannot be excluded by the Russians. But more importantly, the last U.S. sanctions at the start of January, note the sharp decrease in purchases of Russian oil by China, by India, and by Turkey, amongst others. And I mean very sharp reductions precisely because they know that that is a way that they can show that they don't fully support the Russian invasion and that that's how they have to avoid U.S. economic pressure. Big question, will Trump lift those sanctions and give India and China more leeway to get that cheap oil from Russia?
Right. Big question there indeed. Fred Weyer, China playing both sides, you think, here in this game of Game of Thrones, if you can call it that?
Oh, I'm sure they are, and I think that that's fine with Russia. What Russia has wanted, and even through these past very difficult decade, is to reconcile with the United States in the first place.
Right.
The thing that I have always noted, and I have difficulty explaining it to Americans, is that the hostility is not on the Russian side. The average Russian really likes Americans. All opinion polls show, even through the darkest times in the last 3 years, over half of Russians wanted better relations with the United States. So I think that's one thing that I don't think that Russia is going to abandon China. They've invested too much. The supply lines
Right.
have all been shifted from Europe to China.
Right.
So those are realities. But friendly relations with the United States, it seems to me a good possibility. Cooperation on a lot of things. One Russian parliamentarian said to me, "What we want is peaceful coexistence,"
Right.
which is an old term, but it's still a very valid one. Let's just get along.
Yes, let's just get along. Peaceful coexistence. These are all, phrases that we took for granted after the end of the Cold War, Fred Weir, but these are returning to haunt us now. Thank you very much for an exciting discussion. Professor Scott Lucas, Fred Weir, and of course, Abhijit Iyer Mitra.